the next in our series of webinars on leadership and organizational effectiveness. Today's webinar is on making better decisions. My name is Rick Lepsinger. I will be your host and your presenter for today's session. So welcome, everyone. We're going to cover 4 key topics today. We'll talk about what impacts our judgment and our ability to make a good decision. We'll talk a little bit about some practical techniques, things you can do to help overcome these obstacles and increase the effectiveness of your decisions. We'll talk about some decision-making styles, some approaches for making decisions, and the pros and cons of each. And then we'll talk about involving people in decisions to enhance decision quality and decision acceptance. So, despite our best efforts, people still make bad decisions. And it's interesting, because, why is that? Why do smart people or groups of smart people still make bad decisions? And what can we do to increase the likelihood that we'll be able to consistently make better decisions? And that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's start by talking about what impacts our judgment and our ability to make a good decision overall. We'll start with a better understanding of the brain, how it responds to information and how it processes information. So this will be a little bit of an oversimplification, but just to get an idea of the neural systems that are at work and the tension between them and how that impacts our decision making. So the first is what we would call our automatic reactions. These are things that kick in automatically. They don't require any conscious thought or very little conscious thought. An example of this would be a fire chief was interviewed, and they were asking him, how does he make choices in these crisis situations? And his response basically was, I don't make decisions, I act. And that's what the automatic reaction is, the automatic response. We see a situation, it's familiar, and we know what to do. The second is the voluntary processing. And this is a more conscious and deliberate effort to look at the information. It's a bit slower, but rather than just react, we're actually deliberating and looking at the information. And these two processes, these two neural systems are kind of competing for space with us as we're facing choices and situations. The second set of neural systems are emotion and reason. Now, emotion is behavior in response to a situation. Like, for instance, if you feel threatened. So, for example, if you're in the woods and you see a bear, your emotional response might be to run. And of course, this might not be the best thing to do. Standing still may be a much better choice, but again, because we feel threatened, we have fear, we just move forward. So things like anxiety or confidence or exuberance may cause us to act in a certain way. The second of this pair is reasoning, and this is a more rational approach, taking a long-term view, where we're really thinking about the consequences of our action. So with emotion, we just may act without really thinking about the longer-term consequences, but reason is the aspect of our brain and our thinking processes that tries to take a longer view and think about consequences. So these two sets of neural systems are in competition with each other, automatic and voluntary, emotion and reasoning, and they're in competition across as well. So what you're trying to do here is keep these systems sort of in balance, because they all play a role in our ability to make good decisions overall. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that. But in addition to these two sets of neural systems, we also have biases, things that tend to hinder our decision making. Now, these biases in and of themselves are not always bad. These are techniques or behaviors that we have learned to help us manage and deal with an extraordinary amount of data and information that comes our way. They're shortcuts to help us move through the world. And a good percent of the time, these things would work really well for us. But there are occasions when these biases inhibit our ability to make the best choice. The first is this idea of staying in our comfort zone. This is where we go with things that are familiar, things that are brought to mind more frequently. So, for example, when it comes to buying stocks, you might buy a stock of a company whose name you recognize, even though it might not be the best performing company in that particular category. When you're shopping, you might focus on a particular brand of a product, even though it may either cost more or have certain ingredients that are not the best, but you focus on what's more familiar. The second has to do with moving to conclusion without sufficient information. So, for example, you might say, I spoke to 2 of our clients. They're very, very happy. I guess everything is okay and all our systems are good. That may be true for those 2 clients, but it may not be true in general for all your clients. Anchoring this is actually one of my favorite biases. This is where the first information you get tends to anchor your perception or your perspective of a particular situation. So, for example, when they do mock juries, when they show a mock jury information about the defendant's innocence before they show them information about the defendant's guilt, they tend to acquit. But when they show them information about their guilt before they show them information about their innocence, they tend to convict them. So this idea of anchoring is it sort of shapes our perception of the situation. The fourth is confirmation, where we're looking for information or evidence that tends to support our assumption or our hypothesis or our preference. It's kind of selective information gathering and only holding on to the things that support our point of view. And the last is continuing to pursue a course of action that is clearly not winning, that's going to fail, but we do this to either not appear to have made a mistake, to save face, to try to prove we're right, even though when the evidence indicates that, in fact, this really is not worth continual investment and pursuit. So, if these are the things that make it difficult to make good decisions, that impede our ability to make high quality decisions, affect our judgment overall, what can you do to overcome these obstacles? And there are 2 primary ways to go at it. The first is to use a systematic process. And the systematic process helps you balance the automatic and the voluntary. It also helps you balance the emotional with the reasoning. It doesn't necessarily eliminate, but it helps put them in better balance. And the first element of a systematic process is a decision criteria. And what you're trying to do here is identify a few key characteristics that answer the question, what does the best alternative look like, right? And these could include measures of quality, quantity, time, cost, targets or constraints, expected performance. But you're basically trying to define what good looks like before you even start to look at the alternatives. And here are some examples of what decision criteria could look like. And again, they sort of capture what the best alternative would look like when you're trying to choose among several different alternatives. The decision criteria does a number of things for you. One is that it ensures that all the stakeholders have a shared picture. One of the reasons why groups of people, when they're faced with the exact same data, make different decisions is because they have a different criteria of what effectiveness looks like, or about what the best decision looks like. Excuse me. So a decision criteria ensures that everybody has the same idea of what good looks like, and it also defines what information is needed to be able to make the decision, because you're basically looking for information related to your criteria. So it guides your search for information, and it lets you know when you have enough information. And this, by the way, is one of the greatest dilemmas of making decisions. How do you know you have enough information? Should we keep looking for information? How much is enough? And your decision criteria can help you answer that question overall. But let's talk a little bit about data and its impact on decision making. And although you may be surprised to find out, but more data is not always better. Conventional wisdom is the more information you have, the better decision you'll make. But we know that that's not always the case. And I'll share a study with you. There was a research done with experienced horse handicappers, people who bet on the horses, and they were presented with various data sets of different sizes, and they were asked to predict the outcomes based on different variables. And you can see the various information they were given about the jockey's record, the number of days since the horse's race, the weight to be carried overall. So, and here's what they found. And you can see from this chart that as the information increased going along the right, the level of confidence increased dramatically. Their confidence that they would pick the correct horse, they would pick the winner, increased dramatically. As data increased, confidence increased. But as you can see, performance was impacted very little as data increased. Once you had the core set, you can even see that at one point is sort of diminishing returns, and increased data actually starts to have a negative effect on decision quality overall. So again, it goes back to, how do you know when you have enough information? And this is what your chart might look like to help capture your decision criteria on the left and your alternatives on the right. And inside each box where the information is lined up with the criteria, you're now able to say, how well does this alternative meet that criteria? And that's the information you're looking for. If you've got a blank and don't have the data, you can now have a more targeted search. Rather than just throw the net wide looking for any data you can find, you're now looking for specific data related to your decision criteria. So this helps both get a shared picture of what a good decision is, what are you trying to decide, and it also helps you determine what information you need and when you have enough information. The second aspect of overcoming obstacles is involving the right people. And here, this is about ensuring you've got a broad picture, you've got enough information to make the decision, and the right perspective to make the best decision. So there are a number of approaches or styles for involving people. The first is making the decision yourself. And this is where a single individual, based on the information they have, makes the call, makes the choice, and then they tell everyone, this is the way we're going to go forward. This works when there's a crisis or a need for urgent action. It also works when all the alternatives or the options are equally acceptable, that there's not a big difference. And if the decision maker has all the information they need to make a good decision, this approach can work very well. On the downside, it may impact decision acceptance if people are not involved, and it may impact decision quality if, in fact, it turns out the decision maker does not have all the information that's required. The second approach is consultative, and this is where you involve people and ask them for their input. even though the leader or the decision maker keeps the final right to make the final call, you're really asking people for their thoughts and their input. This increases the feeling of involvement and ownership and acceptance of the final outcome, and it also will likely impact decision quality because of the additional information. On the downside, this takes a little bit more time, and in fact, you have people who are just like yes people or groupthink. It could impact the quality of decision or innovation overall. The third style is a consensus or majority, and this is where the decision is discussed by the group, and it's either made by a majority or an overall consensus. This generates significantly higher levels of ownership and buy-in because of the degree of participation. It can have a significant impact on an improvement on decision quality overall. But again, it can be very time-consuming, and it can be very difficult to reach a consensus if goals are not aligned. If everybody in the group has a different goal, a different picture of what they're trying to achieve, it can make consensus decision-making virtually impossible to achieve. So now the question is, which style should I use? What's the best style in this situation? And there are three criteria you should be thinking about. Decision quality in general, decision acceptance, and the amount of time needed to make the decision. So let's take a look at a series of questions that you can ask yourself to determine which style would be most appropriate. The first is, how important is decision quality? What's the impact of this decision and its consequences for the organization overall? And for instance, if you're ordering, paper clips, if anybody does that anymore, that might not be a high impact decision, as if you're trying to order some kind of enterprise-wide software. So the first question is, how is decision quality important? The second is, if it is important, do you as the decision maker have the information you need to make the best decision without the input of other stakeholders? If the answer is no, making the decision by yourself might not be the best way to go, and you might want to consider some form of consultation or consensus. The second is, how important is decision acceptance? To what extent do you need the support of other people to implement the decision? So for instance, if you have all the information to make the decision yourself and you do not rely on others to implement, their acceptance is not critical, or acceptance is assured once you make the decision, then you might be able to make the decision on your own. If acceptance is assured, right, you can make the decision on your own. If the leader does not have the support of others, then doing it yourself and may not work, and moving to consensus or consultation may be more appropriate. The next question is, do stakeholders share your objectives? If they do not, again, making it yourself may be more difficult, but it may also be more difficult to do a consensus decision, because if you give it to the group to decide and they don't share your objectives, they may come back with a choice that you can't live with. It works better, a consensus style works better if people share their objectives. And the next and last is around time. How quick does this decision need to be made? Consultation and consensus take a bit more time, so you need to be thinking about the window of opportunity. And when you're trying to make decisions, especially in a matrix kind of structure, one of the key issues is who has the authority to make the decision? Who is the decision maker? And what's my role in being involved in this decision? So let's take a look at a simple, straightforward model to do that. The biggest challenge is figuring out in your cross-functional teams is who's in charge. And you really want to make sure that you're kind of clarifying that as early on as possible. So a simple tool that you may be familiar with is the RACI model, and this helps you clarify both who to involve and how to involve them. It's one of many role clarification tools. Let's talk a little bit about each one. I'll talk about each one of the key roles. Now here, what's important to remember is that you may disagree with my definition of this role, which is certainly all right. What's important is that if you use a tool like this, that everybody in the group agrees with the definition. That's the main piece. So the first is R, for who's responsible. And this is the person who's in charge of ensuring that the task and the project move forward. You could think of them as a project manager or a team leader. These are the people who bring the group together, who call the meeting, who ensure that people have the information they need, that there's an action plan in place, and things are moving forward. The second role is accountable. This is the person who has the go, no-go decision. This is the person who has the final say. Sometimes the responsible person and the accountable person may be the same, but sometimes they are different. If they're different people, the person who's responsible needs to make sure that they're working closely and coordinating with the person who's accountable. So when it comes time to make the call about go, no go, do this or don't do this, that the accountable person is up to speed and knows where the team and the decision process is overall. The third is consulted. This is not a soft role. This is not ask me for my opinion if you want to. This is a really strong role where you must ask me for my opinion to get my point of view. And again, this may impact, I may be able to provide information to improve quality, but you also may want to increase my acceptance and ownership of the decision. So this is about engaging me, and this is how I'm involved in decision. I don't make the final call, but you need to ask me for my point of view and my input. And the last is informed. These are people who are impacted by the decision, but don't necessarily need to be involved on the front end. They do need to be told about the choice that's been made going forward, so they can ensure that they're doing what they need to do to support the execution and the implementation of that decision. So many of you may have already tried to use this model. Some people find it very helpful. Some people find it to be a bit cumbersome and difficult. The people who find it more helpful tend to follow a few key tips. The first is to start early. Make sure that you're clarifying goals, roles, and decision authority early on when the team first comes together or when the project is first formed, and not waiting until you're right in the midst of the activity to try to work things out. The second is to focus on the critical few actions and decisions. Some people try to chart every possible action, decision, or choice that the team may face. This becomes not only cumbersome, but mind-numbing and not particularly useful. It's much more effective to focus on the critical few actions and decisions that the team will confront. Work out the roles and decision authority for those critical few, like 3 or 5 maybe, and then the others may slipstream through, or people will have a tool to be able to work things out in the moment because they would have had the benefit of this conversation. And the last is around building trust. In order to be able to agree on these roles in a meaningful way and not just pay lip service to them, you need to have high levels of trust. In order for me to let you be accountable, if we're in a cross-functional team, for you to have the final say, and for me to be okay with that, I need to believe that you are working in my best interest and have the credibility and knowledge to be able to make this call, or at least are getting my input to support that call. So to build trust in multifunctional teams, try to meet face to face whenever possible to build relationships. You need to earn the right to make suggestions, and you do that by listening to others. Share information so people have what they need, and involve them in the process, and focus on goals and needs of others. It's called a low self-orientation. It's not just about getting your needs met, but it's also focusing on the needs and goals of others. So, everyone, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today. We do have some time for a couple of questions, if there are any. And let me just see if there's any questions coming up there.
Yeah, Rick, I just wanted to let everybody know that we'll have the slides and a recorded version of this available later this week, and we'll notify everybody.
Okay, great.
And I do have some questions that have come in. First one is, what can you do when stakeholders are always asking you to make a quick decision without having time to develop decision criteria?
Right. Well, and again, that's a good question, and it depends on the situation. Sometimes a quick decision is actually needed, so let's put that aside. The thing about the quick decision, it goes back to, do you have enough information to make that decision well? And if you did make the decision, would everybody be okay with it? So some people are looking for that shortcut. But again, if people would be okay with any decision you made, that's a good starting point. Then you have to ask yourself the question, do you have the information? The caution is not to let that automatic response kick in, because the automatic response is, I've seen this before, I know what it is, I'm just going to go and decide. And you may or may not be accurate about that. And you may want to give yourself some time for that voluntary processing to kick in, so you can really think a little bit about it. So some of it is around a little bit of discipline, and not just, reacting to the situation that you see. So that's what I would say.
What should you do if you truly believe that your decision is the right decision, even though others in your organization disagree strongly?
Yeah, well, see, and that depends on your role, and it depends on the extent to which you need people for implementation. So just in general, if you think you're right and you're not willing to consider the input of others, it's probably better not to go through the motions and pretend to solicit people's input, and you should probably just make the decision yourself. There's a lot of risk involved there, because you better be right. But if you believe you're right and you don't need others' support to do the implementation, then by all means you should just make that decision yourself. But even if you believe you're right and you need the support of others, you may have to find a way to involve and engage them in shaping the project. So for example, you might make the decision, but rather than say, okay, what decision would you make? You might say to people, this is the decision, this is the way we're going, and I need your help in implementation. So let's talk about what you see as the obstacles, let's talk about what you see as the problems, and what your suggestion is to ensure effective implementation. That may help achieve a better balance, again, on the assumption that you're not willing to change your point of view on it. So you're trying to engage people based on the fact you need their support for implementation.
Okay. Our final question, should decision-making skills be a requirement for hiring leaders, or do you think this is something that can be trained?
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that can be learned. There are certain personal characteristics and attributes that impact our judgment and our decision making. For instance, those biases, or even making decisions in a more emotional way. You can learn techniques and processes similar to what I've talked about today to improve and enhance your judgment and your decision making. Now, in hiring, you're certainly looking for people that start out with a better balance, in terms of automatic and voluntary, emotion and reasoning, and are able to deal with these biases. So using behavioral interviewing to get at the extent to which they approach decision making is probably useful. But you're also looking at other characteristics. So if you have somebody who's really strong in some areas, but a little weaker on decision making, you might say, well, look, I can train for better decision making. Net, they're a superior candidate, and I would go with that. But again, it depends on how serious their weakness is in that area.
All right, that's all we have for questions.
Okay, great. John, thanks very much. Everyone, thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you at our next session. Bye, everyone.